Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. So today, as you can see, this is like a collaboration. From the thumbnail. You already know what this video is about. So you guys have asked me tons of questions about moving to New Zealand, but you know what? I have even better options for you. Like, you get to know about New Zealand and Australia. So if you are living in the UK, you're tired of living in the UK, want to move to New Zealand or Australia, you want to know how the country is like, you want to know the process and everything, I have an amazing guest in the building that's going to share every single information with you, everything you need to know. We're going to start from the beginning. So I'm just going to bring my guest off so she can introduce herself.
Hello, hi. So my name is Tembi and I'm 29 years old, and when was it? Oh my God, August 2021, I moved to New Zealand and I spent about 18 months in New Zealand. And after 18 months in New Zealand, I decided to go and travel for a few weeks. And then I moved to Australia. So as of when we're recording this right now, I've been in Australia for it's 2 months, almost 2 months exactly that I've been here. So yeah, New Zealand and Australia.
Oh, that's amazing. I mean, the fact that you've lived in the UK and you moved to New Zealand and now you're in Australia, like, you're the perfect person to talk about moving to New Zealand, because I've had tons of questions. A lot of people want to move to New Zealand based on the recent three pathway that the New Zealand government introduced, which is the straight to resident, work to resident, and they recently opened their border to skilled migrants, and people have been, they just want ideas how to go about it. And you lived in the UK before moving to New Zealand. So before we talk about how you did the whole process, just tell us, like, how was your experience? What did you do? Why did you decide to move to New Zealand now in Australia? Like, what's the story?
Yeah. Well, the story begins in COVID because I'm a registered nurse. I'm a mental health nurse by profession. So that's what I trained in. And that's what I was working as. I've been a qualified nurse since 2017. I'm going to go back all the way back to 2017. So I finished my nursing degree and I was like, let me go and move into my mum and dad's house and try and save for a house over the next like 3 or 4 years. And I'd always wanted to do like a gap year, but I'd never been able to like afford it. And I'd always wanted to just travel and have that experience of like living and working abroad and doing some travel, but it was always like a pipe dream. I put it to the back of my mind. I moved back home. I was like, okay, let's start saving for a house and trying to do like proper adult stuff. And then 2020 arrives. 2020 arrives, the pandemic hits, and as a nurse, obviously I was still out there, I was still working, and I just found myself in 2020, I would say, was like a pivotal year for me because quite a lot of things happened all at the same time, which made me make the decision to actually just leave the country. The first thing was obviously the pandemic, and within the pandemic, being an essential worker, I was very frustrated by the fact that as an essential worker, we were going out every single day, and I hated the clapping. If you lived in England at that time, every Thursday at 8 p.m, people would come up the house and start clapping for us. I absolutely hated that, and the reason why I hated it was because we were like being placed in danger. The government weren't taking our requests for PPE seriously. Boris Johnson was like too late to lock down, and we still had to go and see patients. So I was literally still on the front line, felt so exposed, felt so in danger, didn't feel protected by the government because I was working for the NHS. Really didn't feel protected. A lot of my colleagues were getting sick, and thank heavens I didn't get sick in that time. But it was just a time of just like frustration. And then at the same time, we had George Floyd, who got murdered. As a Black person working in the front line, knowing that COVID was affecting Black people and ethnic minorities more, it was just a really stressful time. And within the lockdown, I think what it did was it just forced me to just look at myself and to think, if I catch COVID tomorrow, because the chances were I was going to catch COVID because we didn't have good PPE, would I really be happy with where my life is right now? And the answer is no, I really wouldn't have, because I'd spent the last 3 years, at mum and dad's house, just waffling, going to work, coming back. I'd gotten into a routine. I wasn't doing what I wanted to do, and now here was this global event, and the chances of me actually catching COVID and dying were very high. And I was like, hey, I might die here. I was like, I might actually die. And have I done everything I wanted to? Absolutely not. I really hadn't. So that's when I was like, actually, what do I want to do? What has been on my bucket list? What have I been putting off for so long? And that was going to live and work in a different country. But then it also coincided with the fact that the British response to COVID was so horrific compared to like New Zealand and Australia. Like, these guys were going to festivals and relaxing, and they, because, their governments had acted early and they'd, done that. So I was like, actually, I just need to get out of the UK, and I don't really have a lot of money saved. I can't really afford it as such. So I was like, what is the best way I can get out of the UK and still be able to like have money to live on? And I was like, actually, I'm a nurse. Let me just have a look and see. So that's why I decided to move in the first place.
Yeah, that's amazing. I mean, sounds to me like you just wanted to go on an adventure, but again, a lot of people don't talk about the struggle, like living in the UK. I myself, coming from Nigeria and working in the UK, I would say that I struggle more here working in the UK than when I was working back home. So when you moved to New Zealand, like overall, how has been your experience as a Black person?
As a Black person in New Zealand, I had a really good experience, very positive overall. And being a Black person, it is literally the thing I was worrying the most about. And I don't know I can't tell you how many times I prayed about it, but I was like, it doesn't seem like there are any Black people, which there really weren't any, but there are a few. But I had a really good experience. In my entire time when I was in New Zealand for 18 months, I not once ever felt like I was being discriminated against. I never felt like someone was like taking, the mick out of me in that way. And I would say, if people were being racist, they certainly kept it to themselves. They didn't say it out loud. And I'm sure, it's the world we live in. You're going to meet people who are racist and discriminatory. But no one was ever like that to my face. I never got stared at or anything like that. Compared to when I'd been in Italy, or I would say really good experiences. And I would say, to add on top of that, when people would ask me where I came from or what my background was, it literally was coming from a place of curiosity. I would say there was a difference between the UK and New Zealand in the way that people would ask about where you're from. I felt like
I was about to say that. I was about to ask you, what's the difference in the UK, comparing New Zealand to the UK, living as a Black person, which one?
It's hard to pinpoint, but you can just tell when someone's like, so where are you from? Or where are you from? It's hard to sort of quantify, but you just know when someone is asking from a place of go back to your own country and what are you doing here, rather than, oh, where are you from? I've genuinely never met anyone like you. And I met lots of people in New Zealand who had never met a Black person. But the majority, which was really good and interesting. So when they'd ask me, oh, where are you from? What does your name mean? That was then my chance for me to talk about my background. I was like, I was born in Zimbabwe, lived in the UK. And it was from a place of genuine well-meaning and never discriminatory. And also I would add, I was living in Auckland, which is incredibly diverse. I was honestly just expecting New Zealand to be all white people. but it is incredibly diverse. There's obviously, the white European population, and then there's also the indigenous Maori population. There are lots of people from the Pacific Islands as well. A lot of people from East Asia, like China, Japan. I had never really encountered that kind of mix of people. And it was just everywhere you looked, there was just someone different. And it felt like the majority of us that were there weren't like originally from there, if that makes sense, apart from like obviously the indigenous Maori people or people who've been there for like generations and stuff. So in that way, I didn't feel like I stood out. I feel like if anything, I blended in, and I just got to like meet people who I would have never met before. Like, where in the world in England would I have met someone from like Samoa or like the Cook Islands or Fiji, or like someone who's Fijian Indian, or something like that. And so that's what I found. It was very diverse. I became close with one of my colleagues was from Samoa, and we were like learning about each other's backgrounds. And I was like, hey, Pacific Islands are very similar, and learning about the Maori population. And so it was, I would say, really, like, it was very educational, very positive for me in Auckland. But obviously there are, New Zealand is massive, and there are places and villages where, there's not that mix, so I wouldn't know what that feels like. But then even in all the places I traveled, because I traveled up and down New Zealand, if you look at some of my vlogs, I still never really felt discrimination, and I feel like I was really lucky. I would say another thing that Black women especially encounter is like when they change their hair. So obviously when you change your hair, people are always very curious. They're like, you changed your hair. But what I found was the complete opposite where I worked, because I found that like people wouldn't say anything, and it was like almost like this big elephant in the room. But then I did later on sort of come to find out that like in terms of like Kiwi culture, they don't want to offend, so they don't say anything. So there are lots of times in which I would come on in braids and I look like a whole different person. People would look at me, but like no one would say anything.
Like in general, what would you say, like your work-life balance, living condition compared to the UK? Like if you were to choose, which would you still prefer to live in the UK, or no, you're happy where you are, and why?
I would say I'm happy where I was really happy where I was in New Zealand in terms of like my work-life balance. But I would say that was an intentional choice that I made. Because obviously nursing is hard wherever you are. People are just as sick as, in England and in New Zealand, people are just as sick as each other. The shifts still need to be done. It's a 24-hour shift cycle. So, still got to do night shifts, you've got to do weekends and stuff like that. So the difficulty of the work doesn't change. But I think what changed and what helped me to have a good work-life balance was me genuinely choosing to only work like the minimum amount of hours I needed to, and to hardly ever take like any overtime shifts, because that was a habit that I'd gotten into in the UK where I would just do overtime and overtime and overtime. Whereas in New Zealand, I was like, I made the choice of I'll only want to do overtime if it's absolutely necessary, if there's no one else to take the shift. But I think I do recognize that that's coming from a very privileged position where I moved for myself. I don't have a family to depend on. Obviously, the work-life balance is going to vary depending on your industry, the department you're working in, what your financial situation is like. So if you do have a family, Auckland is expensive it's really, really expensive. It's not cheap. So if you've got a family, if you've got bills, if you've got mortgages, of course, you're going to be working more or just as hard as you were in the UK. But I would say the balance then comes in with like, there is so much more to do. I felt like I'm a very outdoorsy person. You are never far away from any beaches or water. And I'm talking about some of the most beautiful beaches ever, literally down your doorstep, 15-20 minute drive. Like, So that's where the balance comes in. You can then go and unwind. You can then take the family out at the weekend to go to like a cute beach, the hikes, and almost everyone is fit. Everyone's got, depending on which neighborhood you're living in, people have got their hiking boots on every weekend. You're on a trail, so that then helps you when you go back into work to have that balance. There's more to do. Whereas I feel like in the UK where I was living, I'd only go to the beach like once a year because it's like a 4-hour drive. And even the beach you go to like Brighton or like Bournemouth, I mean, bless, that's nothing compared to some of like, some most beautiful beaches I think I've ever been to in New Zealand. Like, yeah.
Oh, amazing. I mean, the salary, what you're earning now compared to New Zealand, the money you're earning, is it enough for you to, pay your bills and still have something enough to save?
So the UK versus New Zealand, nursing salary wise, New Zealand is better. And I was working, okay, I'll give 2 examples. So in the UK, I was working for the NHS, and in New Zealand, I was working for, it was ADHB, which is Auckland District Health Board, which is basically the NHS equivalent in Auckland. And my pay, if we compare it side by side, I think I was getting paid about the equivalent of like £11,000 more in New Zealand compared to what I was doing in the UK. If we compare it, side by side, and it's a lot. But then I would also say it depends on which area of nursing you're in. I obviously, with the nursing I was doing, it's a 24-hour cycle. So when you work sort of late shifts, weekends, night, they're very generous. Like, for example, in New Zealand, on weekends, during the day, up until 12 o'clock midday, you get paid time and a half. From 12 o'clock midday all the way up until Sunday midnight, it's double. So whatever your base rate is. So pick up a weekend shift, pick up a Sunday shift. If you're already rostered to work there, then you get paid that. Night shift, it was whatever the night rate is. I think in ADHB, it was like $52 an hour, New Zealand dollars an hour, and it's doubled. So if you do like 3-4 night shifts in a row, you can really make some money for yourself. I know at the moment, some of the information I'm saying might be out of date because I think they're in the process of renegotiating a lot of like the nursing pay and stuff like that. And if you do things like a long day, so let's say you do a 12-hour shift, and if you have less than a 12-hour break between shifts, the next day you get paid like time and a half. So I would say New Zealand was a lot more generous in terms of like their penal rates compared to the NHS, where it was really strictly only the trust I worked in anyway. It's only if you're doing like bank shifts, which is like extra shifts, or nights or weekends, but even still, it wasn't quite at the same rate. So I feel like I feel like I definitely did, as a single person, I definitely did earn more than enough money to be able to not only sustain myself, but to save a little bit, and also to have like quite a good lifestyle. As in, you saw my apartment tour. I was able to afford those apartments.
I was so impressed. I'm like, whoa, you must be earning so much to be able to afford this. Like, you can't afford that here in the UK.
Exactly. So I was able to do all of that, but then on the flip side, I then got to a point where I was like, actually, I can't really, if I'm looking to the future, I've got to cut back on some things if I want to save even more. So I had to get rid of the apartment. But like for me as a single person, I was absolutely fine. I can't really speak for a family in a household as to how that would work. But yeah.